On April 9, 1975, at 5:40 in the morning, 4,000 artillery shells began raining down on a small town 37 miles east of Saigon. For the next hour, one of the heaviest bombardments of the entire Vietnam War turned the morning sky orange with fire. North Vietnamese gunners were absolutely certain that nothing could survive what they were unleashing. When the barrage finally lifted and infantry began their assault, they expected to walk through the rubble of destroyed positions and encounter nothing but corpses and the few stunned survivors who would immediately surrender. Instead, they ran straight into concentrated machine gun fire, pre-registered artillery strikes, and a wall of resistance so fierce it would stop the entire North Vietnamese advance in its tracks for 12 days. The battle that followed would become known as South Vietnam's Thermopylae, the last major stand, the final proof that when properly led and adequately supplied, South Vietnamese soldiers could fight with courage and skill that matched any army in the world. Make sure you subscribe to our channel to discover more untold stories from history. This is the story of the Battle of Xuan Loc, the story of 5,000 men who held back 40,000, the story of Brigadier General Minh and the 18th Infantry Division, who went from being called cowboys and considered the worst unit in the South Vietnamese army to earning the name the Supermen for their apocalyptic final stand. This is the story of the battle that delayed the fall of Saigon just long enough for 7,000 Americans and Vietnamese to escape. And this is the story that proves one of the great what-ifs of the Vietnam War. What could have happened if America had not abandoned its ally? By April 1975, it was over. Everyone knew it. The North Vietnamese knew it. The Americans knew it. President Nguyen Van Thieu knew it. And the South Vietnamese soldiers fighting for their country's survival knew it. Since January, the communist forces from the north had been sweeping through South Vietnam like a tidal wave. Province after province fell. City after city collapsed. Thieu fell on March 25th. Da Nang, the second largest city in South Vietnam, fell on March 29th after scenes of absolute chaos as desperate civilians mobbed ships and aircraft, trying to escape the communist advance. The Central Highlands were gone, the northern provinces were gone. South Vietnam had been cut in half. And now, 4 North Vietnamese Army Corps, over 270,000 troops supported by over 1,000 artillery pieces, 320 tanks, and 250 other armored vehicles were closing in on Saigon like the jaws of a vice. American aid had been slashed to almost nothing. South Vietnamese soldiers were rationed to 1.6 rifle rounds per day. Machine gunners got 10.6 rounds daily. The mighty South Vietnamese Air Force, once one of the largest in the world, was grounded for lack of fuel and spare parts. And in Washington, Congress was refusing President Gerald Ford's desperate request for $722 million in emergency military aid. South Vietnam was dying. And at Xuan Loc, a small town at the intersection of Highway 1 and Highway 20, the 18th Infantry Division prepared to make one final stand that would shock the world. The 18th Infantry Division had a reputation, and it was not a good one. For years, American advisors and South Vietnamese commanders alike considered the 18th one of the worst divisions in the entire Army of the Republic of Vietnam. They were known throughout the South Vietnamese military as the Cowboys. Undisciplined, unreliable, more interested in swagger and appearance than in actual fighting. The kind of unit you did not want to depend on in a real fight. The division had been formed in the early 1960s as part of South Vietnam's expansion of its military forces to deal with the growing insurgency. Like many South Vietnamese units, it was organized along American lines, with 3 infantry regiments forming the core of the division, supported by artillery, armor, engineers, and other supporting units. On paper, the 18th looked like any other South Vietnamese division, but in practice, it had problems. Part of the issue was leadership. The division went through a series of commanders who owed their positions more to political connections than military competence. In the complex world of South Vietnamese politics, senior military officers often advanced based on their loyalty to particular political factions, their family connections, or even through outright bribery. Merit was secondary to connections, and the 18th Division suffered as a result. The officers set the tone, and it was not a good tone. Training was haphazard, discipline was lax, corruption was rampant. Supply officers skimmed off supplies to sell on the black market. Commanders issued false reports about their unit strength to collect pay for soldiers who did not exist, pocketing the extra money. Soldiers learned quickly that personal connections mattered more than performance. The best assignments, the safest duties, the easiest jobs, all went to those with the right connections or enough money to buy their way into favorable positions. American advisors assigned to the 18th Division were frustrated by what they saw. They tried to professionalize the unit, to instill proper training and discipline, to make the 18th into an effective fighting force. But they were fighting against a culture of corruption and indifference that was deeply entrenched. Some advisors gave up. Others did what they could, but accepted that the 18th was never going to be a top-tier unit. The division was based in Xuan Loc and the surrounding Long Con province, an area that had seen fighting since the early days of the war. The region was strategically important, sitting astride the main highway from the coast to Saigon and controlling access to the huge American-built military bases at Bien Hoa and Long Binh. Highway 1, the main north-south route through Vietnam, ran right through Long Con province. Highway 20, coming from the Central Highlands, intersected with Highway 1 at Xuan Loc. Control of this crossroads was critical. The area was also home to extensive rubber plantations, a remnant of French colonial rule. The Société de Caoutchouc d'Extrême-Orient owned tens of thousands of acres of rubber trees, and the plantations provided employment for much of the local population. The terrain was a mix of flat plantation land, where the rubber trees were planted in neat rows, and more rugged hills and jungle to the north and east. It was good defensive terrain, if properly used. But for most of the war, the 18th Division seemed content to go through the motions, avoiding major combat when possible, and developing a reputation for being more concerned with appearances than with military effectiveness. They earned their nickname, the Cowboys, through a combination of flashy appearance and poor performance. The officers and men of the 18th liked to look good. Uniforms were tailored and well-maintained. Equipment was polished. When the division paraded or appeared on inspection, they looked sharp. But when it came to actual combat, the 18th had a tendency to avoid engagements, to call in artillery or airstrikes rather than close with the enemy, to retreat when pressed. They talked tough, but did not always fight tough. American advisors nicknamed them the Cowboys because they seemed more interested in looking like soldiers than being soldiers. It was not a compliment. And throughout the South Vietnamese military, the 18th Division was considered a unit you did not want to serve in, and definitely did not want to depend on if you were in a tough fight. Better units looked down on them. Other division commanders complained about them, and the 18th's own soldiers knew they were considered second-rate. Then, in March 1972, everything changed. The North Vietnamese launched the Easter Offensive, a massive conventional invasion with tanks, artillery, and infantry divisions pouring across the demilitarized zone and out of Cambodia. It was the largest offensive since the Tet Offensive 4 years earlier, and it caught South Vietnam at a vulnerable moment. American ground forces were almost entirely gone. The few that remained were mostly advisors. South Vietnam would have to stand or fall on its own. The existing commander of the 18th Division, a man named Lam Quang Tho, proved completely incompetent during the opening phases of the Easter Offensive. He panicked. He issued contradictory orders. He lost control of his units, and South Vietnamese High Command quickly realized that if they did not replace him immediately, the 18th Division was going to collapse, and the eastern approaches to Saigon would be wide open. And in March 1972, as the Easter Offensive raged and South Vietnamese units were being tested like never before, the 18th Infantry Division got a new commander. His name was Minh Dao. He was 39 years old, and he was about to transform one of the worst divisions in the South Vietnamese Army into one of the absolute best. Minh Dao was born on March 5, 1933, in Bien Hoa Commune in Gia Dinh Province near Saigon. He studied at Petrus Kai High School in the capital, completing his high school certificate in February 1952. The following year, he joined the 10th intake of the Tran Binh Trong course at the Vietnamese National Military Academy in Da Lat. In June 1954, he graduated as a first lieutenant and immediately began serving as an instructor at the military academy. Dow rose through the ranks on pure ability. In an army where many senior officers owed their positions to family connections, political influence, bribery, or corruption, Dow was different. He advanced because he was good, because he was a fighter, because he had a tactical mind that few could match, and because he possessed that rarest of qualities in the later years of South Vietnam's existence: integrity. By early 1964, he had been promoted to major and was appointed province chief of Long On. But his time there was cut short. The Military Revolutionary Council, the group of generals who had overthrown and murdered President Ngo Dinh Diem in November 1963, replaced Dow in February 1964. The reason was simple. Junta leader General Nguyen Khan considered Dow a supporter of General Duong Van Minh, and in the Byzantine politics of South Vietnam in the mid-1960s, that was enough to get you removed from command. But Dow kept rising. His competence was undeniable. By 1972, he was a colonel and considered one of the best tactical commanders in the South Vietnamese Army. When the 18th Infantry Division's commander, Lam Quang Tho, proved incompetent during the Easter Offensive, Dow was given command. He was promoted to Brigadier General in November 1972. What happened next was remarkable. Dow took the Cowboy Division, the unit everyone looked down on, and turned it into one of the premier fighting forces in the South Vietnamese Army. The transformation did not happen overnight. It took months of hard work, discipline, and leadership by example. But by 1973, the 18th Division was a completely different unit from what it had been. Dow's first priority was leadership. He removed or transferred officers who were incompetent or corrupt. He promoted based on merit, not connections. He personally interviewed battalion and company commanders to assess their abilities and their commitment to their troops. Officers who did not measure up were replaced. Officers who showed promise were given responsibility and support. Dow built a team of leaders who shared his values and his determination to make the 18th Division the best it could be. Second, Dow demanded discipline. The days of the cowboys, where appearances mattered more than substance, were over. Dow instituted rigorous training schedules. Units trained on marksmanship, small unit tactics, defensive operations, and combined arms coordination. He brought in the best instructors he could find and gave them the authority to train the division properly. Soldiers who had been used to relatively easy duty suddenly found themselves working hard, training constantly, and being held to high standards. Third, Dow led from the front. He did not sit in a comfortable headquarters giving orders. He was out with his troops constantly. He visited positions, he talked to soldiers. He asked about their equipment, their supplies, their families. He made it clear that he cared about them as people, not just as numbers on a roster. And when operations were conducted, Dow was there, often right at the front where he could see what was happening and make immediate decisions. His soldiers saw that their general was willing to share their dangers and their hardships. That built loyalty and respect in a way that no speech or order ever could. Fourth, Dow fought corruption ruthlessly. Supply officers who were caught stealing or selling supplies were removed and prosecuted. Commanders who falsified reports were relieved. The black market operations that had been endemic in the division were shut down. Soldiers began to see that they would actually receive the supplies and equipment they were supposed to get, rather than having it stolen by corrupt officers. This improved morale enormously. When soldiers know they are being treated fairly and that their leaders have integrity, they fight better. Fifth, Dow focused on small unit leadership. He knew that battles are won by squads, platoons, and companies, not by divisions. So he invested tremendous effort in developing his NCOs and junior officers. He sent the best ones to specialized training courses. He empowered them to make decisions and take initiative. He created a culture where junior leaders were expected to lead, not just follow orders. This paid enormous dividends. South Vietnamese units with good small unit leaders could fight effectively even when communications broke down, or when commanders were killed or wounded. By the end of 1972, the 18th Infantry Division was no longer the worst division in the South Vietnamese Army. It was becoming one of the best. American advisors who had previously written off the 18th as hopeless began to take notice. Reports started flowing back to higher headquarters about how the 18th was performing well in operations. The division's kill ratios improved dramatically. They were capturing more enemy weapons and supplies. They were taking and holding objectives, and most importantly, they were not breaking under pressure. Over the next 2 years, from 1973 to early 1975, Thieu continued to refine and improve the division. He personally supervised the construction of defensive positions around Xuan Loc. He had his engineers build bunkers, trenches, and fighting positions that could withstand heavy artillery fire. He pre-positioned ammunition and supplies. He conducted rehearsals and war-gamed different scenarios for how North Vietnamese forces might attack. He prepared his division for the fight he knew was coming. Thieu also developed a reputation for being emotional and passionate. He was not the stereotypical aloof general who maintained a professional distance from his troops. He cared deeply about his men and showed it. He would sometimes cry when delivering eulogies for soldiers who had been killed. He would embrace wounded men in hospitals and tell them he was proud of them. He would erupt in anger when he thought his troops were not being supported properly by higher headquarters. Some people thought this emotionalism was unprofessional, but his soldiers loved him for it. They knew their general cared about them. They knew he would fight for them, and they would fight for him. Thieu was also famous for his battlefield interviews and his defiant statements. He was not afraid to speak his mind, even when his words might anger his superiors. In interviews with journalists, both Vietnamese and foreign, Thieu would speak passionately about his soldiers and about the fight to defend South Vietnam. He became the public face of South Vietnamese military resistance, the general who refused to give up even when the situation seemed hopeless. Unlike many other South Vietnamese generals who came from the wealthy elite or from families with political connections, Thieu was middle class. He had worked for everything he had achieved. He had no powerful patrons to protect him or advance his career. He had risen on merit alone, and perhaps because of that, he had a connection with his soldiers, most of whom also came from modest backgrounds, that many other generals lacked. They saw him as one of them, someone who understood their lives and their struggles. By April 1975, when North Vietnam launched its final offensive, Minh Thieu was 39 years old, a brigadier general, and the commander of what had become one of the elite divisions in the South Vietnamese army. He was about to face the greatest test of his career and his life. And in April 1975, when almost every other South Vietnamese unit was collapsing or fleeing south ahead of the communist advance, the 18th Division under Minh Thieu would prove exactly what they had become. To understand what happened at Xuan Loc, you have to understand what had happened in the months leading up to April 1975. Since the Paris Peace Accords were signed in January 1973, officially ending American involvement in the Vietnam War, North Vietnam had never stopped preparing for the final conquest of the South. The peace agreement was merely a pause, a chance to regroup, resupply, and prepare for the final offensive. By late 1974, North Vietnam was ready. They had rebuilt their forces after the devastating losses of the Easter Offensive. They had constructed a massive logistical network through Laos and Cambodia, including fuel pipelines and all-weather roads that could support large-scale mechanized operations. They had amassed huge stockpiles of Soviet tanks, artillery, missiles, and ammunition, and they had reorganized their forces into 4 corps, a total of 18 divisions ready to strike. Meanwhile, South Vietnam was falling apart. American military aid, which had totaled billions of dollars annually during the height of U.S. involvement, had been slashed to a fraction of what it had been. By 1974, South Vietnamese forces were critically short of fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and every other necessity of modern warfare. Soldiers were given daily ammunition rations measured in single rounds. Aircraft were grounded. Artillery batteries carefully rationed their shells. The South Vietnamese military had gone from being one of the best-equipped forces in the world to facing shortages of even basic supplies. Politically, South Vietnam was in chaos. President Nguyen Van Thieu, who had ruled since 1967, was under tremendous pressure. There had been assassination attempts. On January 23, 1975, an ARVN officer had tried to shoot Thieu with his pistol, but failed. On April 4th, a South Vietnamese Air Force pilot named Nguyen Thanh Trung had bombed the Independence Palace with his F-5 Tiger fighter in another assassination attempt. The government was riddled with corruption and paralyzed by infighting. Morale was collapsing. And then North Vietnam struck. In early 1975, they launched what they called Campaign 275, initially intended as a limited offensive to set up for a larger attack the following year. But when the South Vietnamese forces in the Central Highlands collapsed far faster than anyone expected, North Vietnamese commanders saw an opportunity. They kept attacking, kept advancing, and kept winning. Ban My Thuot fell on March 4th after only 8 days of fighting. President Thieu ordered a withdrawal from the Central Highlands, trying to consolidate his forces closer to Saigon. But the withdrawal turned into a rout. Pleiku and Kon Tum were abandoned. Thousands of soldiers and civilians fled east toward the coast on Route 7B in a nightmare convoy that was repeatedly attacked and eventually disintegrated. Then the northern provinces fell. Thieu fell on March 25th. Da Nang fell on March 29th in scenes of utter chaos. Entire divisions simply dissolved. Officers abandoned their men and fled by helicopter or boat. Civilians mobbed ships and aircraft in desperate attempts to escape. The South Vietnamese I Corps and II Corps effectively ceased to exist. By early April, North Vietnam controlled the entire northern half of South Vietnam. And II Corps, the 3rd and the 4th, with a combined strength of over 8 divisions and hundreds of tanks, were converging on Saigon from the northwest and northeast. The only thing standing between the communist forces and the capital was a thin defensive line running from Tay Ninh in the northwest through Bien Hoa to Vung Tau in the southeast. And at the eastern anchor of that line, at the critical crossroads town of Xuan Loc, was the 18th Infantry Division. Xuan Loc was not a large town. It had about 10,000 inhabitants. It was a rubber plantation community, part of the vast holdings that French companies had established during colonial times. The Société de Caoutchouc d'Extrême Orient still owned extensive plantations in the area. Xuan Loc was a working town, not particularly strategic in itself, but its location made it one of the most important pieces of real estate in South Vietnam. Xuan Loc sat at the intersection of 2 critical highways. Highway 1, which ran the entire length of Vietnam from the Chinese border all the way south through Saigon to the Mekong Delta, and Highway 20, which came from the Central Highlands through Da Lat and connected to Highway 1 at Xuan Loc. These 2 highways gave Xuan Loc control over the eastern approach to Saigon. More specifically, whoever controlled Xuan Loc controlled access to Bien Hoa and Long Binh. Bien Hoa was home to one of the largest air bases in Southeast Asia. Long Binh was the massive logistics base that had been the nerve center of American operations during the war. Both were now critical South Vietnamese installations, absolutely essential to the defense of Saigon. If North Vietnam could take Xuan Loc, they would control the main road from the northeast straight into Saigon. They would be able to shell Bien Hoa Air Base with artillery, shutting down air operations. They would cut off any possibility of South Vietnamese reinforcement or resupply from the east. They would be able to mass their forces for a direct assault on Saigon from the east, while other corps attacked from other directions. Taking Xuan Loc would essentially open the gateway to the capital. The South Vietnamese Joint General Staff understood this perfectly. Despite the catastrophic losses in the north, despite the shortage of everything from bullets to fuel to hope itself, they knew Xuan Loc had to be held. If Xuan Loc fell, Saigon would be indefensible. The war would be over within days. So they committed everything they had left. They ordered the 18th Infantry Division to hold Xuan Loc at all costs. And they began rushing reinforcements from what little remained of South Vietnam's strategic reserve. President Thieu himself gave the order to Le Minh Do, hold Xuan Loc, buy time. Show the world that South Vietnam could still fight. And Dao, looking at his officers and men, gave them his answer in words that would echo through history. I am determined to hold Xuan Loc. I don't care how many divisions the communists will send against me. I will smash them all. The world shall see the strength and skill of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. On April 8, 1975, the day before the battle began, the forces at Xuan Loc represented one of the most lopsided matchups of the entire war. The South Vietnamese defenders numbered somewhere between 20,000 and 25,000 troops, but only about 12,000 were in Xuan Loc itself. The rest were spread across defensive positions in the surrounding area. The 18th Infantry Division formed the core of the defense. It consisted of 3 infantry regiments, the 43rd Regiment, the 48th Regiment, and the 52nd Regiment. Each regiment was supposed to have 3 battalions, but by April 1975, losses and shortages meant that most units were under strength. Supporting the 18th Division were 5 armored brigades equipped with M48 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers. There were 4 regional force battalions, local militia units that knew the terrain. The 340th, 342nd, 343rd, and 367th battalions. 2 artillery units, the 181st and 182nd Artillery Battalions, equipped with a total of 42 artillery guns, a mix of 105mm and 155mm howitzers, and 2 companies of the People's Self-Defense Force, local civilians armed and trained for basic defense. As the battle developed, reinforcements would arrive. The 1st Airborne Brigade would be flown in. 3 more armored brigades, the 315th, 318th, and 322nd, the 8th Task Force from the 5th Division, the 33rd Ranger Battalion. By the height of the battle, South Vietnamese forces at Xuan Loc would number around 25,000 to 30,000 troops. Air support came from 2 South Vietnamese Air Force divisions, the 5th Air Force Division based at Bien Hoa, and the 3rd Air Force Division at Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon. They flew F-5 fighters, A-1 Sky Raiders, A-37 Dragonflies, and AC-119 and AC-47 gunships. But they were critically short of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Every sortie had to count. The commander at Xuan Loc was Brigadier General Minh Dao. Supporting him was Colonel Nguyen Van Phuc, the chief of Long Con Province, who handled coordination with local forces and civilian authorities. Against them, North Vietnam deployed the entire 4th Army Corps, 3 full infantry divisions, the 6th Infantry Division, the 7th Infantry Division, and the 341st Infantry Division. Each division had 3 regiments of infantry, artillery, and support units. The 4th Corps also had the 71st Anti-Aircraft Regiment, 2 combat engineering regiments, the 26th Communications Regiment, 2 armored battalions with T-54 and PT-76 tanks, 2 artillery battalions with 130mm guns and multiple rocket launchers, and 2 Long Con provincial battalions of communist guerrillas who knew the local terrain. As the battle developed, North Vietnam would commit even more forces. Elements of the 2nd Corps would arrive from the northwest. The 6th Infantry Division from the 3rd Corps would reinforce the attackers. Eventually, a 4th Division, essentially making it 4 full North Vietnamese divisions, attacking 1 South Vietnamese division. The North Vietnamese forces numbered at least 40,000 troops. Some estimates put it higher, perhaps as many as 50,000 when all reinforcements had arrived. They had hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles. They had overwhelming artillery superiority with batteries of heavy guns, including the dreaded 130mm cannons that outranged anything the South Vietnamese had. The commander of the 4th Army Corps was Major General Hoang Cam. His deputy commander, Colonel Bui Cat Vu, would control operations from the east. Later, Lieutenant General Tran Van Tra, commander of all Viet Cong forces in the south and one of North Vietnam's most experienced generals, would arrive to personally oversee the final phase of the battle. The odds were somewhere between 4-1 and 7-1 in favor of the North Vietnamese. They had more troops, more tanks, more artillery, more ammunition. They had momentum after weeks of uninterrupted victory. They had orders to take Xuan Loc quickly and open the road to Saigon. And they expected the 18th Division to collapse just like almost every other South Vietnamese unit had collapsed over the previous month. They thought the battle would be over in a day or 2 at most. What they got instead would shake their confidence and their timeline and prove far more costly than anyone in Hanoi had imagined. The bombardment began at 5:40 in the morning on April 9, 1975. 4,000 artillery rounds and rockets slammed into South Vietnamese positions around Xuan Loc over the next hour. It was one of the heaviest artillery barrages of the entire Vietnam War. The ground shook, the sky lit up, trees were shredded, buildings collapsed, bunkers caved in. Anyone caught in the open was killed instantly. The North Vietnamese artillery included batteries of 130mm guns, massive weapons with a range of over 27 kilometers that could fire a shell weighing 33 kilograms. These guns, supplied by the Soviet Union, outranged anything the South Vietnamese had. North Vietnamese gunners could sit back in relative safety and pound South Vietnamese positions without fear of effective counter-battery fire. They also employed 122mm rockets, fired from truck-mounted launchers which could saturate an area with explosives. And they had mortars of every caliber, from 82mm to 120mm, positioned closer to the front lines to hit specific targets. The bombardment was carefully planned and coordinated. North Vietnamese forward observers had spent days identifying South Vietnamese positions, command posts, artillery batteries, ammunition dumps, and troop concentrations. When the bombardment began, North Vietnamese gunners worked from target lists that had been prepared in advance. They walked their fire across the South Vietnamese defensive positions, methodically pounding every identified location. North Vietnamese gunners were certain that nothing could survive what they were unleashing. The plan was simple: pound the defenders into rubble with overwhelming artillery, fire, then send in the infantry supported by tanks to mop up whatever was left. Major General Hoang Kham expected his forces to be inside Xuan Loc by noon. By nightfall, he planned to be reorganizing his units for the push toward Bien Hoa and Saigon. But Le Minh Dao had prepared his defense as well. His soldiers were not sitting in exposed positions waiting to be blown apart. They were in bunkers, trenches, and fighting positions that had been carefully constructed over the previous weeks. Dao had learned the lessons of previous battles. He knew the North Vietnamese would begin with a massive artillery barrage, so he had his engineers build overhead cover for critical positions. Bunkers were reinforced with layers of sandbags, logs, and even steel plating scavenged from damaged vehicles. Communication trenches connected the positions so troops could move without exposing themselves. And critically, Dao had positioned his troops in depth, not all bunched up on the front line, where a single artillery barrage could destroy entire companies. The South Vietnamese soldiers endured the bombardment as best they could. They huddled in their bunkers as the earth heaved and shook around them. They kept their weapons clean and ready. They checked their ammunition. They waited for the barrage to lift, knowing that the moment it did, the infantry assault would begin. Some prayed, some thought about their families, some simply focused on their training and prepared to do their jobs. At approximately 6:40 in the morning, as the artillery barrage shifted deeper into the South Vietnamese positions, the North Vietnamese infantry attack began. This was textbook Soviet-style combined arms assault. Artillery would prepare the battlefield, then tanks and infantry would advance together, with the tanks suppressing enemy positions while the infantry assaulted and cleared them. Supporting fires would be called in as needed, and fresh units would be committed to exploit any breakthrough. From the northwest, the 341st Infantry Division attacked with its 266th and 270th Regiments. These were veteran units, experienced troops who had fought throughout the war. The 266th Regiment moved down the Nui Sac Lu Valley, a natural corridor that led toward Xuan Loc from the north. The 270th Regiment advanced through the hills and rubber plantations to the west. Their objective was to capture the communications center and police station north of the town, then push south into Xuan Loc itself. Once they controlled the northern part of the town, they could bring up their heavy weapons and artillery observers and start systematically reducing the South Vietnamese positions in the center of Xuan Loc. The 266th and 270th Regiments advanced with confidence. They had been told the South Vietnamese were demoralized and likely to collapse. They had been told the 18th Division was one of the worst units in the South Vietnamese army. They had been told this would be an easy fight. They were wrong. As the lead elements of the 266th Regiment emerged from the early morning mist and advanced toward the communications center, South Vietnamese forward observers spotted them immediately. The observers, positioned in concealed observation posts with excellent fields of view, picked up their radios and called in pre-planned artillery concentrations. Within seconds, South Vietnamese 105mm and 155mm howitzers opened fire. The shells, which had been pre-registered on likely North Vietnamese approach routes, landed with devastating accuracy. The first North Vietnamese troops to reach the communications center found themselves advancing into a kill zone. Machine gun positions that had been carefully sighted to cover the approaches opened fire from mutually supporting positions. If North Vietnamese troops took cover from one machine gun, they exposed themselves to another. Rifle fire from entrenched infantry positions cut down attackers. M79 grenade launchers lobbed 40mm grenades into North Vietnamese troop concentrations, and the artillery kept falling, turning the area into a hellscape of exploding shells and flying shrapnel. But the North Vietnamese kept coming. This was what they had trained for. This was what they had done successfully at a dozen other locations over the past month. They took casualties, but kept advancing. Officers and NCOs urged their men forward. Supporting weapons suppressed South Vietnamese positions, and sheer numbers began to tell. Despite heavy losses, North Vietnamese troops fought their way closer to the communications center. After more than an hour of heavy fighting, they managed to capture the communications center and the nearby local police station. North Vietnamese soldiers poured into the buildings, killing or capturing the South Vietnamese defenders who had not been able to withdraw. For a brief moment, it looked like the attack was succeeding. North Vietnamese officers radioed back to headquarters that they had achieved their first objectives and were pushing forward. At 4th Corps headquarters, Major General Hoang Com allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The attack was going according to plan. And then the South Vietnamese counterattack hit them. Elements of the 52nd Infantry Regiment, which had been held in reserve for exactly this moment, launched a powerful counterattack from the south. Minh had anticipated this scenario. He knew the North Vietnamese would try to seize key positions in the northern part of the town, and he had units ready to counterattack immediately before the North Vietnamese could consolidate their hold on those positions and bring up reinforcements. The South Vietnamese infantry, supported by M48 tanks that had been positioned in hull-down positions where they could provide covering fire, hit the North Vietnamese troops who had just captured the communications center. The North Vietnamese, exhausted from the fight to take the position, and not yet organized to defend it, were caught off balance. The fighting was brutal, close range, often hand-to-hand in the rubble of the damaged buildings. South Vietnamese soldiers, fighting on terrain they knew intimately and motivated by the knowledge that their country's survival hung in the balance, fought with ferocious determination. The South Vietnamese artillery, which had been supporting the defense with pre-planned fires, now shifted to supporting the counterattack. Shells fell on North Vietnamese positions just hundreds of meters away. Smoke rounds provided concealment for the attacking South Vietnamese troops. High explosive rounds pounded North Vietnamese troop concentrations and prevented reinforcements from reaching the fight. After 2 hours of close quarters combat, the South Vietnamese recaptured the communications center. The North Vietnamese troops who had taken it were dead, wounded, or retreating. By mid-morning, the communications center and police station were back in South Vietnamese hands. The 351st Division's attack from the north had been stopped cold. Bodies of North Vietnamese soldiers littered the approaches to the town, and the 266th and 270th Regiments were falling back to reorganize, having lost hundreds of men in the failed assault. To the northeast, the 7th Infantry Division was having an even worse time. They had been ordered to attack between the Soiret and Song Vong rivers, a natural corridor that provided a relatively straight approach to Xuan Loc from the northeast. But there was a reason that corridor was unobstructed. The South Vietnamese had identified it as a likely avenue of approach and had prepared accordingly. The 7th Division's infantry had been ordered to attack across open ground without their tank support, which had been delayed by the difficult terrain and was supposed to catch up later. It was a disastrous decision. South Vietnamese soldiers in prepared defensive positions, with clear fields of fire across the open ground, simply cut them down. M60 machine guns, the standard machine gun for South Vietnamese forces, fired from bunkers that had been positioned weeks earlier. Each machine gun position could cover the others, providing interlocking fields of fire that made it almost impossible for attacking infantry to find safe routes of advance. South Vietnamese riflemen, armed with M16 rifles and positioned in trenches and fighting positions, fired accurately and methodically. They knew the range to every piece of terrain in front of their positions. They had range cards showing where to aim for targets at different distances. They fired aimed shots, not wild bursts of fire, and they were good. Many of these soldiers were veterans, men who had been fighting for years and had become expert marksmen through hard experience. And the South Vietnamese artillery was devastating. Forward observers, working from prepared observation posts with excellent visibility, called in fire. Old missions on the attacking North Vietnamese infantry. The artillery battalions had spent weeks preparing for this. They had range cards and target reference points already worked out. They could put shells on target within minutes of receiving a fire mission. And they had plenty of ammunition, at least for the first few days of the battle. The result was a slaughter. North Vietnamese infantry tried to advance and were cut down by machine gun fire. They tried to find cover and were hit by artillery. They tried to infiltrate through the plantation rubber trees and were spotted and engaged by alert South Vietnamese soldiers who knew every path and trail in the area. The 7th Division's attack stalled within the first hour, having made virtually no progress and suffering enormous casualties. At 8 in the morning, North Vietnamese commanders finally managed to get 8 T-54 tanks forward to support the 7th Division's infantry. The T-54 was a capable tank, with a 100mm main gun and thick armor that could stand up to most weapons the South Vietnamese had. The plan was for the tanks to suppress the South Vietnamese bunkers with their main guns and machine guns, allowing the infantry to close in and assault the positions. The tanks rumbled forward toward the South Vietnamese positions near Bao Chan, a hamlet, a small village that formed part of the outer defenses of Xuan Loc, and 3 of them were immediately destroyed by entrenched South Vietnamese soldiers with M72 Law rockets and 106mm recoilless rifles. The M72 Law, or light anti-tank weapon, was a single-shot disposable rocket launcher that could penetrate the armor of most tanks if fired at close range. South Vietnamese soldiers had been trained in its use and had prepared positions specifically to engage tanks. The first tank was hit by a Law rocket fired from a concealed position less than 100 meters away. The rocket penetrated the tank's side armor and exploded inside, killing the crew instantly. The second tank, trying to maneuver away from the threat, exposed its thinner side armor to a 106mm recoilless rifle team that had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The recoilless rifle's heat round, or high explosive anti-tank, punched through the armor and turned the tank's interior into an inferno. The third tank was hit by multiple Law rockets in quick succession, one of which penetrated the engine compartment and set the tank on fire. The other 5 tanks, seeing 3 of their number burning and under heavy fire, withdrew. Tank crews are brave, but they are not stupid. Advancing into prepared positions where the enemy has effective anti-tank weapons and knows how to use them is a recipe for disaster. The North Vietnamese tankers pulled back, leaving their burning vehicles behind. To the south, the 6th Infantry Division's flanking attack achieved some initial surprise but quickly ran into determined resistance. Major General Hoang Kam had personally supervised the movement of the 6th Division into positions south of Xuan Loc, marching them around the town at night to avoid detection. The hope was that this flanking attack from an unexpected direction would catch the South Vietnamese off balance and allow North Vietnamese forces to break into Xuan Loc from the south, while the defenders were focused on threats from the north and east. But Le Minh Dao had anticipated this possibility. He had not concentrated all his forces facing north and east. He had mobile reserves positioned centrally so they could respond to threats from any direction. And he had armored units, including M48 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers, positioned to cover multiple approaches. When the 6th Division attacked from the south, they found South Vietnamese armored units waiting for them. The M48 Patton tank, the main battle tank used by South Vietnamese forces, was an excellent vehicle. It mounted a 90mm main gun that could destroy any North Vietnamese tank. It had thick armor that could withstand most enemy fire, and South Vietnamese tank crews had been trained by Americans and had years of combat experience. They knew how to fight. The battle that developed south of Xuan Loc was primarily an armored engagement. North Vietnamese T-54 tanks, supported by infantry, attacked South Vietnamese positions, defended by M48 tanks and mechanized infantry. The two sides traded fire at ranges from a few hundred meters to over a kilometer. Tanks maneuvered for position, trying to get flank shots on enemy vehicles. Infantry tried to work close enough to engage the opposing tanks with rocket launchers. Artillery from both sides pounded the battlefield. The South Vietnamese had the advantage of prepared positions and better training. Their tanks were dug in or positioned behind cover where only their turrets were exposed. They could engage the attacking North Vietnamese tanks while presenting minimal targets. And they had infantry nearby with anti-tank weapons to protect them from North Vietnamese infantry trying to get close. After several hours of fighting, the 6th Division's attack from the south was also stopped. Several North Vietnamese tanks were burning. Infantry units that had tried to advance without proper armor support had been cut up by machine gun and rifle fire, and the South Vietnamese defensive line remained intact. By midday on April 9th, every major North Vietnamese attack had been repulsed. The assault from the north by the 341st Division had captured the communications center temporarily, but had been driven back by a South Vietnamese counterattack. The attack from the northeast by the 7th Division had been shattered by fire from prepared positions and effective use of anti-tank weapons. The flanking attack from the south by the 6th Division had made no significant progress against South Vietnamese armored units. The South Vietnamese defenders were still in their positions. Xuan Loc had not fallen, and Major General Hoang Cam was looking at casualty reports that shocked him. His forces had lost over 700 men killed on the first day of the battle. Some estimates put the number even higher, perhaps as many as 800 dead. The 266th Regiment had suffered particularly heavy casualties in the fight for the communications center. The 7th Division's infantry had been badly mauled in the open ground northeast of Xuan Loc. Tank companies reported losing multiple vehicles to anti-tank fire. Meanwhile, the South Vietnamese had lost fewer than 50 men killed. They had taken more wounded, perhaps 200 or 300, but the exchange ratio was stunning. For every South Vietnamese soldier killed, the North Vietnamese had lost 15 or more. This was not supposed to happen. Based on the performance of other South Vietnamese units over the past month, the 18th Division should have collapsed under the weight of the initial assault. Instead, they had held. They had counterattacked. They had fought with a skill and determination that completely contradicted North Vietnam's intelligence assessments. That night, as both sides regrouped and prepared for the next day's fighting, North Vietnamese commanders held urgent meetings at 4th Corps headquarters. Something had gone very wrong. The 18th Division was fighting far better than expected. Their positions were well prepared. Their artillery support was effective. Their soldiers were not running, and casualties were far higher than anyone had anticipated. A new plan would be needed. More troops would have to be committed. This was not going to be the quick victory Hanoi had expected. And in the South Vietnamese command post, in Xuan Loc, Le Minh Dao gathered his officers and told them what the next day would bring. More attacks, more artillery, more casualties. The North Vietnamese were not going to give up after one day's fighting. They would keep coming. They would throw more troops into the battle. They would pound Xuan Loc with artillery until the town was rubble. This was going to be a long fight. But they had held on the first day. They had proven they could stand against anything the North Vietnamese could throw at them. And they were going to keep standing for their country, for their families, for each other. That night, as both sides regrouped and prepared for the next day's fighting, one thing was clear. This was not going to be the walkover that Hanoi expected. The Battle of Xuan Loc was going to be a real fight. April 10th began with another massive artillery bombardment. North Vietnamese commanders had realized that their infantry could not simply walk through South Vietnamese positions. They were going to have to pound the defenders into submission with overwhelming firepower. Thousands more shells rained down on Xuan Loc. Rockets screamed in from multiple positions. The town itself began to look like a moonscape of craters and rubble. But again, the South Vietnamese soldiers survived. They stayed in their bunkers during the bombardment. They kept their ammunition dry. They maintained their fighting positions. And when the North Vietnamese infantry attacked, they met them with concentrated fire that turned each assault into a bloodbath. The North Vietnamese 4th Corps tried a different approach. Instead of focusing on one or two axes of attack, they began probing all around the South Vietnamese defensive perimeter, looking for weak points, small unit actions, company-sized assaults, infiltration attempts, trying to find somewhere, anywhere, where they could break through and start rolling up the South Vietnamese line. They found nothing but resistance. Le Minh Dao had deployed his forces well. He had strong points covering all the major approaches. He had mobile reserves that could quickly move to reinforce any threatened sector. He had artillery support that could be called in within minutes. And he had soldiers who were fighting for their lives, their families, and their country, with a desperation that made them extraordinarily dangerous opponents. On April 11th, the attacks continued. The North Vietnamese threw more troops into the battle. The 341st Division kept hammering at the northern approaches. The 7th Division kept trying to force the corridor from the northeast. The 6th Division kept pressing from the south and west. Tanks tried to break through. Infantry tried to infiltrate at night. Artillery pounded the South Vietnamese positions day and night. And the South Vietnamese held. They called in airstrikes when they could. AC-47 spooky gunships circled overhead at night, their miniguns pouring tracers down onto North Vietnamese troop concentrations. South Vietnamese artillery battalions worked around the clock, firing mission after mission in support of the infantry. Forward observers called in danger-close artillery strikes when North Vietnamese troops got too close to their positions. On April 12th, South Vietnam committed more of its dwindling reserves to the fight. The 1st Airborne Brigade, one of the elite units in the South Vietnamese military, was flown into Xuan Loc. 3 more armored brigades arrived, the 315th, 318th, and 322nd, bringing more M48 tanks and M113 armored personnel carriers. The 8th Task Force from the 5th Division arrived. The 33rd Ranger Battalion, another elite unit, was committed to the defense. The arrival of these reinforcements was critical. They gave Le Minh Dao more depth to his defense, more reserves to commit to counterattacks, more firepower to throw at the North Vietnamese assault. But every unit sent to Xuan Loc was one less unit available to defend somewhere else. South Vietnam was emptying its strategic reserve, committing almost everything it had left to this one battle. And in the air, South Vietnamese pilots were flying themselves to exhaustion. The 5th Air Force Division at Bien Hoa and the 3rd Air Force Division at Tan Son Nhut were flying between 80 and 120 combat sorties per day. They were dropping bombs, firing rockets, strafing North Vietnamese positions, resupplying the defenders by helicopter, evacuating the wounded, flying so many missions that maintenance crews could barely keep the aircraft flying. But it was working. By April 13th, 4 days into the battle, the North Vietnamese had made virtually no progress. They had not broken through anywhere. They had not taken Xuan Loc. And their casualty reports were staggering. After 4 days of fighting, North Vietnamese forces had suffered approximately 2,000 killed. The South Vietnamese, while taking casualties, had lost only a few hundred. The exchange ratio was something like 10-1 in favor of the South Vietnamese. This was unprecedented. In most of the battles over the previous month, South Vietnamese units had collapsed quickly, often without much of a fight. At Xuan Loc, the North Vietnamese were learning what properly trained, properly led, and properly motivated South Vietnamese soldiers could do, and they were learning that taking Xuan Loc was going to cost them far more than they had ever imagined. On April 13th, a man arrived at the 4th Corps headquarters who would change the course of the battle. Lieutenant General Tran Van Tra, the overall commander of Viet Cong forces in South Vietnam and one of the most experienced generals in the North Vietnamese military, had been sent by Hanoi to personally oversee the capture of Xuan Loc. Tran Van Tra looked at the situation and immediately saw the problem. The 4th Corps had been trying to take Xuan Loc by frontal assault, throwing troops at prepared defensive positions and getting slaughtered in the process. The South Vietnamese had too much firepower, too much air support, and too much determination for that approach to work quickly. A different strategy was needed. Tra identified the weak point in the South Vietnamese defense. It was not the town itself. The defenses there were too strong. The weak point was Dau Gia, a position to the west of Xuan Loc where the South Vietnamese defensive line was stretched thin. If North Vietnamese forces could capture Dau Gia, they could cut Highway 1 between Xuan Loc and Bien Hoa. That would isolate Xuan Loc, cutting off reinforcement and resupply. Tra also ordered blocking positions established along Highway 2, which ran from Xuan Loc south to Ba Ria and Vung Tau on the coast. If that road could be cut as well, Xuan Loc would be completely surrounded. The defenders could be starved of ammunition, fuel, and supplies. They could be pounded with artillery, and eventually, they would have to surrender or withdraw. The new plan was implemented immediately. The 6th Infantry Division and elements of the 341st Division were given the mission to capture Dao Giai. Other units began moving to cut Highway 1 and Highway 2, establishing blocking positions to prevent South Vietnamese reinforcements from reaching Xuan Loc. On April 15th, the North Vietnamese artillery stopped pounding Xuan Loc itself and shifted their fire to Bien Hoa Air Base. In just one day, the massive barrage forced the 5th Air Force Division at Bien Hoa to cease all operations. The runways were cratered, aircraft were damaged or destroyed on the ground, fuel and ammunition dumps were hit, South Vietnamese air operations from Bien Hoa were shut down. To keep supporting the defenders at Xuan Loc, the South Vietnamese had to mobilize the 4th Air Force Division, based at Binh Thuy Air Base in the Mekong Delta, much farther south. But those aircraft had to fly much longer distances to reach Xuan Loc, which meant fewer sorties and less time over the battlefield. On April 16th and 17th, the North Vietnamese attacked Dao Giai with overwhelming force. The 6th Infantry Division and the 95B Infantry Regiment hit the South Vietnamese 8th Task Force and 3rd Armored Brigade defending the position. After 2 days of fierce fighting, Dao Giai fell. Highway 1 between Xuan Loc and Bien Hoa was cut. South Vietnamese forces tried desperately to reopen the road. The 322nd Task Force and the 1st Airborne Brigade, 2 battalions of elite paratroopers, attacked west from Xuan Loc toward Dao Giai, trying to fight their way through. They ran into stiff resistance. The North Vietnamese had committed significant forces to holding their blocking positions. The South Vietnamese attack made some progress, but could not break through. By April 17th, Xuan Loc was effectively isolated. North Vietnamese forces controlled the roads to the north, west, and south. The only way in or out was by helicopter, and those flights were becoming increasingly dangerous as North Vietnamese anti-aircraft units moved closer to the town. Inside Xuan Loc, the situation was becoming critical. Ammunition was running low. The wounded were piling up. Buildings that had survived the first week of bombardment were now collapsing under continued shelling. And Le Minh Dao and his men knew they were surrounded, but they kept fighting. Every North Vietnamese attack was met with fire. Every infiltration attempt was detected and destroyed. Every probe was driven back. The 18th Division was cut off, outnumbered, running low on supplies and taking casualties. But they were not breaking. And on April 18th, something happened that showed the world exactly what the defenders of Xuan Loc thought about their chances. Peter Arnett, a reporter for the Associated Press who had covered the war for years, managed to get into Xuan Loc to interview General Le Minh Dao. The interview would become one of the most famous moments of the entire battle. Peter Arnett found Le Minh Dao in his command post, a reinforced bunker that was being shaken by near-constant artillery fire. Dao was exhausted. He had been commanding the defense for 9 days with little sleep. His uniform was dirty, his face was drawn, but his eyes were still fierce, still determined, still radiating the emotional intensity that made him such an effective leader. Arnett asked Dao about the situation, about the odds, about whether he thought Xuan Loc could hold, and Dao, looking directly at the camera, gave an answer that would echo through history and become one of the defining statements of South Vietnam's final days. The communists could throw their entire army at Xuan Loc, Dao said. The 18th will stand fast. He talked about his soldiers, about how they had fought for 9 days against impossible odds, about how they had held when everyone expected them to break, about how they had proven that South Vietnamese soldiers, when properly led and properly supplied, were the equal of any troops in the world. And then Arnett pressed him. He pointed out that the situation was hopeless, that Xuan Loc was surrounded, that no help was coming, that the American Congress had rejected President Ford's request for emergency aid, that South Vietnam had been abandoned by its ally. Dao's face hardened. His voice became choked with emotion, and he said words that would haunt anyone who heard them. Please tell the Americans you have seen how the 18th Division can fight and die. Now, Please go." It was a statement of defiance and despair all at once. Defiance because Thieu and his men were still fighting, still holding, still refusing to give up even when the cause was lost. Despair because they knew they had been abandoned, that the ally who had promised to stand with them had walked away, that they were going to die for a country that would cease to exist in a matter of days. The interview was broadcast around the world. It shocked people who had assumed South Vietnam would simply collapse without a fight. It showed a general who was not running, who was not fleeing by helicopter while his men died, who was standing with his troops and preparing to die with them if necessary. And it raised uncomfortable questions in Washington and other Western capitals. What if South Vietnam had received the aid it needed? What if American support had not been cut off? What if Congress had approved President Ford's request for emergency military assistance? Could South Vietnam have survived? Could battles like Xuan Loc have become the norm instead of the exception? But by April 18th, those questions were academic. The reality was that Xuan Loc was surrounded. South Vietnamese forces were running out of time, running out of ammunition, and running out of options. On April 18th, Major General Nguyen Van Thuan, the commander of the 3rd Corps, which included all South Vietnamese forces defending the approaches to Saigon, met with President Nguyen Van Thieu. The news he delivered was devastating. The South Vietnamese forces at Xuan Loc were beaten. The 18th Division had fought magnificently, but could not hold much longer. And more broadly, South Vietnam's armed forces could only hold out for a few more days at most, as a result of their losses on the battlefield. The strategic reserve was gone. Almost everything South Vietnam had left was committed to defending Xuan Loc, and those forces were surrounded and being ground down. There were no more reinforcements to send, no more reserves to commit. The cupboard was bare. Inside Xuan Loc, the situation was indeed desperate. The town itself was a pile of rubble. Buildings that had stood for decades were reduced to burned-out shells or piles of broken concrete. The streets were cratered. Fires burned everywhere, and the smell of death hung over everything. The South Vietnamese defenders were taking over 20,000 artillery shells and rockets per day. The bombardment was constant, relentless, overwhelming. North Vietnamese artillery had complete freedom of action because there was no counter-battery fire heavy enough to suppress them. They could sit back at safe distances and simply pound Xuan Loc into dust. Ammunition was critically low. The 18th Division's artillery batteries were down to a handful of shells per gun. Infantry companies were rationing their rifle ammunition, telling soldiers to make every shot count. The armored units had burned through most of their fuel and were parking their vehicles in defensive positions to use as fixed gun platforms. Medical supplies were almost exhausted. The aid stations and makeshift hospitals were overflowing with wounded. With helicopter resupply becoming almost impossible due to heavy anti-aircraft fire, there was no way to evacuate the most seriously wounded or bring in fresh medical supplies. Food and water were running low. The defenders were on reduced rations. Many positions had been without resupply for days. But they kept fighting. North Vietnamese infantry tried repeatedly to break into the town. Every attack was met with fire, machine guns, rifles, the remaining artillery, point-blank fire from the M48 tanks that were dug in as pillboxes. The South Vietnamese soldiers knew they were surrounded, knew they were cut off, knew that defeat was probably inevitable, but they kept fighting anyway. On April 19th, the order finally came. The Joint General Staff in Saigon, recognizing that Xuan Loc could not be held much longer and that losing the entire 18th Division would be catastrophic, ordered Le Minh Dao to withdraw, pull back to Bien Hoa, establish a new defensive line, save what was left of his division for the final defense of Saigon. Dao received the order and had to make the hardest decision of his military career. He knew his men could still fight. They were still holding their positions. They were still inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy, but they were surrounded, outnumbered, running out of everything they needed to continue the battle. And orders were orders. That night, Dao and his staff began planning the withdrawal. It would have to be done at night, under fire, through enemy-controlled territory, with thousands of wounded who would have to be carried, with equipment that would have to be destroyed so it could not fall into enemy hands. It was going to be incredibly difficult and dangerous, but at least it would be done on their terms. The 18th Division would not surrender. They would not lay down their arms. They would fight their way out of Xuan Loc, and they would march to Bien Hoa with their heads held high, knowing they had done something extraordinary. The withdrawal from Xuan Loc began on the night of April 20th, 1975. Heavy rain began falling that afternoon, which was a blessing. The rain would provide some cover. It would reduce visibility for North Vietnamese observers. It would make airstrikes and artillery observation more difficult. And it would give the South Vietnamese defenders a slight advantage as they prepared to break out of the encirclement. Le Minh Dao organized the withdrawal by echelon. The least mobile units would go first, the wounded who could be moved, the artillery that could still be moved, vehicles that still had fuel. They would head south along Route 2, the road toward Ba Ria and Vung Tau, trying to punch through the North Vietnamese blocking positions there. The main body of the division would follow, the infantry regiments, the armored units, moving in organized formations, maintaining unit cohesion, ready to fight if they encountered heavy resistance. The 1st Airborne Brigade, the elite paratroopers who had been flown in as reinforcements, would serve as the rear guard. They would be the last ones out. They would cover the withdrawal of everyone else, and they would fight off any North Vietnamese forces that tried to interfere with the retreat. As darkness fell and the rain continued, the first echelons began moving, trucks and armored vehicles loaded with wounded, artillery pieces being towed, infantry companies marching in formation. They moved as quietly as possible, hoping to get clear of Xuan Loc before the North Vietnamese realized what was happening. For several hours, it worked. The rain and darkness provided enough cover. The South Vietnamese units made progress south, moving through the rubber plantations along dirt roads and trails. North Vietnamese forces, perhaps assuming the defenders would stay in their positions overnight as they had every other night, did not immediately react. But by the early morning hours of April 21st, North Vietnamese commanders realized what was happening. The defenders were withdrawing, and if they escaped, the North Vietnamese would lose their chance to destroy the 18th Division completely. North Vietnamese units began moving to intercept the withdrawal. Artillery fire began falling along Route 2. Infantry and tanks moved to block the road. And as dawn broke on April 21st, the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Airborne Brigade, serving as the rear guard near Soi Sa Hamlet, ran into a heavy North Vietnamese force. The fighting was brutal and close range. The paratroopers were outnumbered and caught in the open as they tried to cover the withdrawal of the rest of the division. North Vietnamese infantry and tanks surrounded the battalion. Artillery pounded their position. And despite fighting with tremendous courage, the 3rd Battalion was overwhelmed and destroyed. It was the only major success North Vietnamese forces had during the entire withdrawal. The rest of the 18th Division, along with the other units that had been defending Xuan Loc, successfully broke through and made it to Bien Hoa. They were exhausted, they were bloodied, they had taken 30% casualties, but they had made it out. And Le Minh Dao, unlike so many other South Vietnamese generals who fled by helicopter when their positions were threatened, marched out on foot with his troops. He would not leave his men. He would not abandon them to save himself. He would walk every step with them, share every danger, and lead from the front just as he had throughout the entire battle. Later that day on April 21st, North Vietnamese troops moved cautiously into the deserted town of Xuan Loc. They found nothing but rubble and bodies. The town had been demolished. What had once been a thriving community of 10,000 people was now little more than a pile of shattered buildings and cratered earth. But the 18th Division had escaped. They had held for 12 days against overwhelming odds. They had inflicted thousands of casualties on the enemy. They had destroyed 37 North Vietnamese tanks. They had killed over 5,000 North Vietnamese soldiers by most estimates, with some counts putting the number even higher. And they had proven, beyond any possible doubt, what South Vietnamese soldiers could do when properly led, properly equipped, and given a reason to fight. On the afternoon of April 21st, 1975, the same day Xuan Loc fell, President Nguyen Van Thieu appeared on South Vietnamese television to address the nation. What followed was one of the most emotional and controversial speeches in the history of South Vietnam. Thieu looked haggard and defeated. He had been under tremendous pressure for months. The military situation had collapsed. The economy was in ruins. The National Assembly was demanding his resignation. And now, with the fall of Xuan Loc, it was clear that South Vietnam had only days left to exist as an independent nation. Thieu's speech was remarkable for its raw emotion and bitter accusations. He did not hide his anger. He did not try to spin the situation as anything other than what it was: complete and total defeat. And he blamed the United States. He reminded the television audience of the promises that had been made, how President Richard Nixon had assured him, both publicly and in secret letters, that the United States would support South Vietnam, how American officials had promised that if North Vietnam violated the Paris Peace Accords, the United States would respond with military force, how South Vietnam had been told repeatedly that America would not abandon its ally. All of those promises had been broken. American military aid had been slashed to a fraction of what it had been. Congress had refused President Ford's request for emergency assistance. The American people had turned their backs on South Vietnam, and now South Vietnamese soldiers were fighting and dying while their supposed ally did nothing. Thieu specifically mentioned the fall of Xuan Loc. He praised the 18th Division. He talked about how they had fought for 12 days against overwhelming odds, how they had shown the world what South Vietnamese troops could do. And he asked, with tears streaming down his face, what more could have been expected from his soldiers. And then Nguyen Van Thieu announced his resignation as President of the Republic of Vietnam. He was stepping down. He was handing power to his Vice President, Tran Van Huong. Perhaps, Thieu said, a new leader could negotiate with the communists. Perhaps someone else could find a way to save something from the disaster. He could not. The speech was broadcast around the world. It shocked people who had not been following the situation closely. It embarrassed American officials who had to defend their decision to cut aid to South Vietnam. And it marked the effective end of organized South Vietnamese resistance. Tran Van Huong would serve as president for only a few days before himself resigning and handing power to General Duong Van Minh, who would become South Vietnam's final president for the few days remaining before Saigon fell. But by the evening of April 21st, everyone knew the war was over. It was just a matter of how many more days it would take for North Vietnamese tanks to reach the presidential palace in Saigon. But South Vietnam's military still had one card left to play. On April 22nd, the day after Xuan Loc fell and President Thieu resigned, the South Vietnamese Air Force deployed a weapon that had never been used before in Vietnam. A weapon so powerful it was described as the most powerful non-nuclear weapon in the American arsenal, the CBU-55 fuel-air explosive bomb. The CBU-55 was a 750-pound cluster bomb that worked completely differently from conventional explosives. Instead of containing high explosives, it was filled primarily with propylene oxide, a highly flammable fuel. When dropped, the bomb would release 3 submunitions that would disperse the fuel in an aerosol cloud over a large area, roughly 4 acres. Then, after a short delay, an explosive charge would detonate, igniting the fuel cloud. What happened next was terrifying. The fuel would explode in a massive fireball that consumed all the oxygen in the area and generated an enormous overpressure wave. Anyone caught in the blast would either be killed instantly by the fireball, suffocated by the oxygen depletion, or have their internal organs ruptured by the overpressure. It was a thermobaric weapon designed to kill everything in a wide radius. The United States had developed the CBU-55 during the Vietnam War, but had used it only sparingly in testing. By April 1975, South Vietnam had largely been conquered, and the U.S. military was preparing for the final evacuation. But someone decided that before the end came, South Vietnam should have access to the most powerful conventional weapon America had. A single CBU-55 was flown from Thailand to Bien Hoa Air Base. Major General Homer Smith, the senior American military officer still in Vietnam, cleared the way for the South Vietnamese government to use the weapon against North Vietnamese forces. The target was chosen, the headquarters of the 341st Infantry Division, one of the units that had attacked Xuan Loc, and was now positioned near the town, preparing for the final push towards Saigon. On April 22nd, a South Vietnamese C-130 Hercules transport aircraft took off from Bien Hoa, carrying the CBU-55 loaded on a pallet. The massive 4-engine transport climbed to 20,000 feet, 6,100 meters, and circled over the target area. Then the crew opened the rear cargo ramp, and the pallet with the CBU-55 was pushed out of the back of the aircraft. The bomb fell. The submunitions separated and released their fuel, creating a massive vapor cloud over the area where North Vietnamese troops were concentrated. And then the cloud ignited. The explosion was visible for miles, a massive fireball 4 acres in size. Anyone on the ground in that area had no chance. The fireball consumed everything. The overpressure wave crushed anyone nearby, and the oxygen depletion suffocated those who might have survived the initial blast. Reconnaissance aircraft flew over the target area shortly after the explosion. The damage was catastrophic. Experts estimated that approximately 250 North Vietnamese soldiers had been killed, primarily by oxygen depletion, rather than burns or blast effects. An entire battalion had effectively been erased from existence by a single bomb. It was the only time the CBU-55 was used in combat during the Vietnam War. South Vietnam surrendered 8 days later. The weapon would never be used again in that conflict. But the use of the CBU-55 sent a message. Even in its final days, even when defeat was inevitable, South Vietnam was still fighting, still using every weapon at its disposal, still inflicting casualties on the enemy. It was a gesture of defiance from a nation that knew it was about to die. After the fall of Xuan Loc and the resignation of President Thieu, the end came quickly. North Vietnamese forces, having been delayed by 12 days at Xuan Loc, now raced to close the noose around Saigon before any kind of negotiated settlement could be reached. The remnants of the 18th Division, along with what was left of the 1st Airborne Brigade, elements of the Marine Division, Ranger battalions, and various other units fell back toward Bien Hoa. They tried to establish a new defensive line, but it was hopeless. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of supplies. North Vietnamese forces simply went around them or pounded them with artillery until they fell back further. By April 27th, approximately 100,000 North Vietnamese troops surrounded Saigon. They were in position to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Ho Chi Minh Campaign, as North Vietnam called the final offensive to conquer the South, was entering its climactic phase. Inside Saigon, chaos reigned. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were trying to flee. The port at Vung Tau was mobbed with people trying to get on ships. Tan Son Nhut Air Base was overwhelmed with refugees trying to board any aircraft that might take them out of the country. American officials were frantically trying to evacuate American citizens and the South Vietnamese, who had worked with the Americans and would face certain retribution when the communists took over. On April 29th, North Vietnamese artillery began shelling Tan Son Nhut Air Base. The last fixed-wing aircraft evacuations ended. Operation Frequent Wind began, the helicopter evacuation from the American Embassy and other sites around Saigon. For the next 18 hours, helicopters flew back and forth between Saigon and U.S. Navy ships offshore, lifting out more than 7,000 Americans and South Vietnamese. The final South Vietnamese resistance crumbled on April 30th. Some units fought to the end. Others simply disbanded. South Vietnamese Air Force pilots flew their helicopters and planes to aircraft carriers offshore or to Thailand, unwilling to let their aircraft fall into communist hands. Soldiers abandoned their weapons and uniforms and tried to blend into the civilian population. At 7 in the morning on April 30th, Duong Van Minh, who had been president for only 3 days, went on the radio to announce the surrender of South Vietnam. He ordered all South Vietnamese forces to lay down their arms and stop fighting. And at 11:30 in the morning on April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the Independence Palace in Saigon. A North Vietnamese soldier ran up to the building and planted the Viet Cong flag on the balcony. The Vietnam War was over. South Vietnam ceased to exist, and the country was unified under communist rule. The Battle of Xuan Loc cost both sides dearly, though the exact casualty figures remain disputed and controversial. According to North Vietnam's official account, approximately 2,036 South Vietnamese soldiers were killed or wounded, and another 2,731 were captured during the battle. However, those figures are almost certainly incomplete and do not account for all the South Vietnamese forces engaged. The 18th Infantry Division alone suffered over 30% casualties out of approximately 12,000 soldiers committed to the battle. That means The 18th Division lost roughly 3,600 men, killed, wounded, or missing. When you add in the casualties from the reinforcing units, the 1st Airborne Brigade, the armored brigades, the Ranger battalions, the artillery units, and various other formations, South Vietnamese casualties were likely in the range of 5,000 to 6,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. For North Vietnamese forces, the cost was far higher. While official Vietnamese sources claim only 460 killed and 1,428 wounded, those numbers are considered laughably low by Western historians and even by some Vietnamese sources. The actual North Vietnamese casualties were almost certainly far higher. South Vietnamese sources and Western analysts estimate that North Vietnamese forces lost approximately 5,000 to 6,000 killed during the Battle of Xuan Loc. Some estimates go even higher, as much as 7,000 killed. When you add in wounded, which typically runs 3 to 4 times the number killed in modern warfare, total North Vietnamese casualties were likely in the range of 20,000 to 30,000 men. The 18th Division also claimed to have destroyed 37 North Vietnamese tanks during the battle. That number appears to be well documented and is generally accepted as accurate. Dozens more armored vehicles were damaged or disabled. The North Vietnamese 341st Infantry Division, which bore the brunt of much of the fighting in the northern sector, was so badly mauled that it had to be withdrawn from combat on April 12th for rest and refitting. It would not participate in the final assault on Saigon. Other North Vietnamese divisions also took heavy casualties, forcing commanders to commit fresh units and reinforcements that they had hoped to use in the battle for Saigon itself. The exchange ratio at Xuan Loc was remarkable. For every South Vietnamese soldier killed or wounded, North Vietnam lost somewhere between 3 and 5 soldiers killed or wounded. In a war where South Vietnamese forces had often suffered worse casualty ratios than their opponents, Xuan Loc stood out as proof of what properly led ARVN units could achieve. But the battle's true cost cannot be measured only in casualties. Xuan Loc cost North Vietnam 12 days. 12 days when their advance towards Saigon was stopped. 12 days when they could not proceed with their final offensive. 12 days that allowed the Americans to complete their evacuation preparations and ultimately lift 7,000 people out of Saigon by helicopter. For South Vietnam, Xuan Loc cost them their last mobile reserves. Almost everything they had left was committed to that battle. When those forces fell back towards Saigon, battered and exhausted and depleted by casualties, there was nothing left to replace them. The cupboard was bare, and Xuan Loc cost South Vietnam something less tangible but equally important. It cost them hope. When President Thieu resigned on April 21st, everyone knew the war was over. There would be no miraculous last-minute salvation, no sudden reversal of fortune, no intervention by the United States. South Vietnam was going to fall, and it was only a matter of days. After the fall of Xuan Loc, Minh and the remnants of the 18th Division fell back to Bien Hoa. They were ordered to help defend the airbase, which was critical to South Vietnam's final defense. But by then, it was clear the situation was hopeless. Ammunition was almost exhausted, fuel was gone, spare parts did not exist, and North Vietnamese forces were closing in from all directions. When President Duong Van Minh announced South Vietnam's surrender on April 30th, most South Vietnamese military officers faced a terrible decision. Some fled the country. They got on helicopters or boats or planes and escaped to Thailand, the Philippines, or ships offshore. Some took off their uniforms and tried to disappear into the civilian population. And some, convinced that the communists would honor the Geneva Conventions regarding prisoners of war, surrendered. Minh did none of those things. He knew the communists would not honor the Geneva Conventions. He knew what was coming. Re-education camps, prison, probably years of hard labor and indoctrination. But Dao was a Catholic, and he was morally opposed to suicide, unlike some other South Vietnamese generals who took their own lives rather than face communist rule, and he was not going to run. On May 9th, 1975, 9 days after the fall of Saigon, Minh turned himself in to communist authorities. He was immediately arrested and sent to a re-education camp. What followed was 17 years of hell. The The so-called re-education camps were prisons in everything but name. The prisoners were forced to perform hard labor, building roads, clearing jungle, working in fields. The conditions were brutal. Food was scarce. Medical care was non-existent. Prisoners died from malnutrition, disease, overwork, and abuse. And the re-education itself was a form of torture. Hours every day of political indoctrination. Criticism sessions where prisoners had to confess their crimes against the revolution. Self-criticism sessions where they had to denounce themselves and everything they had fought for. The communist authorities wanted to break them, to turn them into model socialist citizens who would renounce their past and embrace the new order. Minh Dao refused to break. He endured the hard labor. He survived the starvation. He sat through the endless indoctrination sessions, but he never renounced what he had done. He never apologized for defending South Vietnam. He never agreed that his cause had been wrong. For 17 years, Dao remained in the camps while the world largely forgot about him and the other South Vietnamese officers and soldiers who had fought against communism. His family, left behind in Vietnam, suffered as well. The families of former South Vietnamese military officers were persecuted. They had difficulty getting education, jobs, housing. They were second class, citizens in the new Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Dao's children grew up knowing their father was in prison, knowing he was suffering, but unable to do anything about it. His daughter, Michelle Chen, was 7 years old when her father was incarcerated. She and her siblings would grow up without him, not knowing if he would survive or when they might see him again. Finally, on May 4, 1992, after 17 years in prison, Minh Dao was released. He was 59 years old. He had spent nearly a fifth of his life in communist prisons. But he had survived. In 1993, Dao was granted political asylum in the United States. He emigrated along with most of his family. They settled in America, trying to rebuild lives that had been shattered by war and its aftermath. Dao eventually became a restaurant manager, a mundane job for a man who had once commanded thousands of troops and held off an entire North Vietnamese army corps. But Dao carried his experience at Xuan Loc with him for the rest of his life. He gave interviews over the years, talking about the battle, about his soldiers, about what they had accomplished. And he always insisted on one thing: he was not the hero. His men who died at Xuan Loc and in the 100 battles before were the true heroes. Minh Dao died on March 19, 2020, at the age of 87. He died in the United States, a refugee from the country he had tried so hard to defend. But his legacy lives on. The story of Xuan Loc, the story of the 18th Division, the Supermen, the story of South Vietnam's last stand. The Battle of Xuan Loc is often cited by historians and military analysts as proof of one of the great what-ifs of the Vietnam War. What could South Vietnam have achieved if American support had not been cut off? What could have happened if Congress had approved President Ford's request for emergency military aid? What would the outcome have been if South Vietnamese forces had been adequately supplied with ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and air support? Xuan Loc suggests some uncomfortable answers to those questions. The 18th Division, properly led by Minh Dao and adequately supplied for the first week or so of the battle, fought with skill and courage that matched any army in the world. They held off forces that outnumbered them by as much as 7-1. They inflicted casualty ratios of 5-1 or better in their favor. They destroyed dozens of tanks. They killed thousands of enemy soldiers. And they did it while surrounded, cut off, and fighting under the most difficult conditions imaginable. If that was what one South Vietnamese division could do when properly led and adequately supplied, what could the entire South Vietnamese military have accomplished under similar conditions? During the Easter Offensive of 1972, when American air support was still available and ammunition was not rationed, South Vietnamese forces had held off an even larger North Vietnamese offensive. They had taken heavy casualties, but they had held. The North Vietnamese had been forced to settle for a negotiated peace instead of outright victory. Could that have happened again in 1975 if circumstances had been different? Could South Vietnam have survived if American aid had continued at previous levels? The defenders of Xuan Loc certainly thought so, and their performance suggests they might have been right. But Xuan Loc also proved something else. It proved that leadership matters. The 18th Division had been considered one of the worst units in the South Vietnamese army until Le Minh Dao took command. Under his leadership, they became one of the best. They went from cowboys to supermen in just 3 years. That transformation did not happen because of equipment or training or American advisors. It happened because Dao led them, because he demanded excellence, because he led from the front, because he earned their loyalty and respect. And Xuan Loc proved that when South Vietnamese soldiers believed they were fighting for something that mattered, they could fight with extraordinary courage and determination. The men defending Xuan Loc knew the war was lost. They knew South Vietnam was going to fall. They knew they had been abandoned by their American allies. But they fought anyway. They fought for their families, for their comrades, for the country they believed in, even as that country was dying. They fought because it was the right thing to do. That kind of moral courage is rare. That kind of determination in the face of hopeless odds is the stuff of legend. And the men who held Xuan Loc for 12 days in April 1975 deserve to be remembered for what they achieved. From a purely strategic perspective, the Battle of Xuan Loc had significant consequences for both sides, though it ultimately could not change the war's outcome. For North Vietnam, Xuan Loc was a severe shock to their timeline and their plans. When North Vietnamese forces began their final offensive in early 1975, they expected South Vietnam to collapse quickly. Most ARVN units had indeed dissolved without much fight. Cities and provinces fell in days or even hours. Hanoi's military planners assumed that Xuan Loc would fall the same way. Maybe a day of fighting, maybe 2 at most. Then the road to Saigon would be open. Instead, Xuan Loc held for 12 days. 12 days when North Vietnamese forces could not advance toward Saigon. 12 days when they had to commit more and more troops to the fight, including units they had planned to use in the assault on the capital. 12 days of unexpectedly heavy casualties that forced them to bring up fresh divisions to replace the ones that had been mauled. That 12-day delay had real consequences. It gave the United States time to prepare and execute Operation Frequent Wind, the helicopter evacuation from Saigon. Without the delay at Xuan Loc, North Vietnamese forces might have reached Saigon several days earlier, potentially before the evacuation was ready. American personnel and the South Vietnamese who had worked with them might have been trapped, leading to a hostage situation, or worse. The delay also gave tens of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians time to flee. Many made it to Vung Tau and escaped by boat. Others got out through Tan Son Nhut before it was shut down by artillery fire. Without those 12 days, the refugee crisis would have been even worse than it was. For South Vietnam, Xuan Loc was both a triumph and a tragedy. It was a triumph because the 18th Division proved that South Vietnamese soldiers could fight effectively when properly led. They showed the world what they were capable of. They gave South Vietnam one final moment of pride before the end. But Xuan Loc was also a tragedy because it cost South Vietnam its last reserves. Everything they had left was committed to that battle. When those forces fell back from Xuan Loc, exhausted and depleted, there was nothing left to defend Saigon with. The final week of South Vietnam's existence was essentially a mopping-up operation for North Vietnamese forces facing minimal organized resistance. Military historians have described Xuan Loc as South Vietnam's Thermopylae, a reference to the ancient battle where 300 Spartans and their allies held off a massive Persian army in a narrow pass. Like Thermopylae, Xuan Loc was a delaying action fought against overwhelming odds by men who knew they were probably going to die. Like Thermopylae, it became a symbol of courage and resistance. And like Thermopylae, it ultimately could not change the strategic outcome of the war. But also like Thermopylae, Xuan Loc mattered. It mattered because it showed what was possible. It mattered because it bought time for others to escape. And it mattered because the men who fought there deserved to be remembered for their courage and sacrifice. The legacy of the Battle of Xuan Loc is complicated and controversial. In Vietnam today, under communist rule, the battle is portrayed as part of the glorious liberation of the South. North Vietnamese forces, despite taking heavy casualties, eventually captured Xuan Loc and continued their advance towards Saigon. In the official narrative, the battle demonstrated the inevitability of communist victory and the determination of the People's Army to complete the revolution. That narrative ignores or minimizes the reality of what happened. The reality was that South Vietnamese forces held off attackers who outnumbered them by as much as 7-1 for 12 days. The reality was that North Vietnamese casualties were approximately 5 times higher than South Vietnamese casualties. The reality was that the North Vietnamese advance was stopped cold and only succeeded when the defenders were finally ordered to withdraw because they had run out of ammunition and supplies. In the South Vietnamese diaspora community around the world, especially in the United States where thousands of Vietnamese refugees settled after 1975, Xuan Loc is remembered very differently. It is remembered as South Vietnam's finest hour, as proof that the South Vietnamese military, when properly led and supplied, could have defended their country successfully, as evidence that the United States abandoned an ally who was willing and able to fight. Among military historians and analysts, Xuan Loc is studied as a case study in several different aspects of warfare. It is studied as an example of effective defensive operations. Minh Dao's use of prepared positions, pre-registered artillery fires, mobile reserves, and counterattacks is textbook defensive doctrine executed under extremely difficult conditions. It is studied as an example of the importance of leadership. The transformation of the 18th Division from an unreliable unit to an elite fighting force under Dao's command demonstrates how much difference effective leadership can make. It is studied as an example of what happens when military forces are starved of supplies and support. South Vietnamese forces at Xuan Loc fought magnificently, but they eventually had to withdraw because they ran out of ammunition, fuel, and other essentials. All the courage and skill in the world cannot overcome basic logistical realities. And Xuan Loc is studied as a cautionary tale about the consequences of abandoning allies. The United States had promised to support South Vietnam. Those promises were broken. And the result was the fall of South Vietnam, the deaths of tens of thousands of people, the imprisonment and re-education of hundreds of thousands more, and a refugee crisis that saw more than 1 million Vietnamese flee their country over the following years. For the men who fought at Xuan Loc, the survivors who made it out and eventually escaped Vietnam, the battle is remembered with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride because they did something extraordinary, because they stood and fought when others ran, because they proved their worth as soldiers and as men. Sorrow because it was not enough, because their country died anyway, because so many of their comrades fell at Xuan Loc or in the years of re-education camps that followed. When veterans of the 18th Division gather today, often in Vietnamese communities in the United States, they talk about Xuan Loc. They remember the men who did not make it out. They remember Minh Dao, who died in 2020, and his refusal to abandon his troops even when he knew the cause was lost. They remember 12 days in April 1975 when they held the line against impossible odds. And they want the world to remember as well. They want people to know that South Vietnamese soldiers were not the incompetent, cowardly troops that some American popular culture portrayed them as. They want people to know that when properly led and adequately supported, they were the equal of any military in the world. They want people to know about Xuan Loc. The Battle of Xuan Loc was the last major battle of the Vietnam War. It was fought from April 9th to April 21st, 1975, by men who knew their country was dying, but fought anyway. It was a battle that should have been a walkover for North Vietnamese forces, but instead turned into a 12-day ordeal that cost them thousands of casualties and delayed their advance towards Saigon. It was a battle where 5,000 South Vietnamese soldiers held off 40,000 North Vietnamese troops, where one division destroyed 3. Where courage and leadership and tactical skill almost compensated for impossible odds and inadequate supplies. The Battle of Xuan Loc proved what South Vietnam could have been if circumstances had been different, if American support had continued, if supplies had been adequate, if leadership like Minh Dao's had been the norm instead of the exception. It proved that South Vietnamese soldiers could fight, that they could win, that they deserved better than the abandonment they received. On April 30th, 1975, 9 days after Xuan Loc fell, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The war was over. South Vietnam was gone. And the men who had fought at Xuan Loc faced either prison, death, or exile. But what they did in those 12 days in April 1975 will never be forgotten. Not by military historians who study the battle, not by the Vietnamese diaspora community that keeps the memory of South Vietnam alive, and not by anyone who believes that courage in the face of impossible odds deserves to be honored and remembered. The men of the 18th Infantry Division, Le Minh Dao's Supermen, held the line at Xuan Loc. They bought time for thousands to escape. They inflicted grievous casualties on an enemy that outnumbered them by as much as 7-1. They proved that the right soldiers with the right leadership could accomplish extraordinary things. And they gave South Vietnam one final moment of pride before the darkness fell. This was the Battle of Xuan Loc. This was South Vietnam's Thermopylae. This was the last stand. This was the proof that abandonment has consequences, and that courage deserves to be remembered. The 18th Infantry Division held Xuan Loc for 12 days, when the world expected them to collapse in hours. They were called cowboys. They became supermen, and their story deserves to be told.